Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the West Virginia Rivers Coalition PFAS Lunch and Learn. We have brought together a panel of experts today to shed light on the emerging issue of PFAS contamination in water across the state of West Virginia. Some of you may have attended one of our previous sessions, which covered the source water data and supporting the PFAS Protection Act. And today's programming will include updates since some of those previous conversations. So today we will be talking about the recently released finished water data and the actual implementation of that PFAS Protection Act that passed this past legislative session. So we want to recognize before we get started that this meeting is one piece of the much larger puzzle where we are aiming to address the public's concerns and provide insight into this widespread environmental challenge. So we recognize that many people have a lot of questions coming into the room today about this topic, and we may not have all of the answers today, but we are committed to engaging together so that we can better understand the nature of this complex issue and the multifaceted approach that we all must take to address it. So we can advance to the next slide. My name is Maria Russo, and I'm the Clean Water Campaign Coordinator for the West Virginia Rivers Coalition, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. West Virginia Rivers is a statewide nonprofit that advocates for clean, drinkable, swimmable, and fishable rivers. And I'm joined by an awesome group of experts today who have a lot of information to share with you. So our experts in the room today include Jenna Dodson, our staff scientist at West Virginia Rivers Coalition, Dr. Alan Dukotman, Professor Emeritus from West Virginia University, Evan Hansen, a member of the West Virginia House of Delegates and Principal at Downstream Strategies, and Scott Mandarola, the Deputy Cabinet Secretary of the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. Before we jump into their presentations, I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping items. So a quick reminder, if there is a group of you watching this webinar together, we do ask that you go ahead and register for the meeting invite. That way you'll be able to get all of the follow-up information with important programmatic updates and materials coming out of the meeting today. We also want to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded and will be sent to you to download for reference following the meeting. Another item that you'll receive is a short survey following the completion of this webinar. We ask that you please take a few minutes to let us know what you thought and how you hope to stay engaged with this work as we move forward. A couple last items to note. We will have a Q&A at the end of our session today. All of our presenters will be answering questions, so you can feel free to type your questions into the chat box at any time during the meeting. We will answer the questions placed into the chat first, and then we'll ask people to raise their hands at the start of the Q&A segment so that we can call on people one at a time to ask their questions directly to the presenters. At this time, we're going to start out with a quick poll. I'm going to share that. So you should see a poll pop up on your screen. The first question asks, do you live in an area known to be affected by PFAS contamination? Can everybody see the poll on their screen? Awesome. The second question asks what your most frequently used drinking water source is. Is it municipal water, such as city water, you might have heard it called, or is it well water? There's also I do not know options for all of these questions in case you're not sure. Jenna, could you let me know if the poll is letting you answer the questions?
I don't see the poll, but I think that's because I'm a co-host.
Okay, thank you. Can anybody else see the poll?
Yes,
I can.
Yes.
Awesome. People are
Yes.
saying it worked.
Yeah.
Yes,
Great.
and filled it out.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
I answered the poll. So
Beautiful. Thank you, everyone.
Maria, it looks like 88% have participated, and that has slowed down considerably. So I think that's
Awesome.
probably, yeah, but we'll get.
Thanks, Heather. I cannot see that recorded on the screen. Would you mind sharing any of the results if you are able to see them?
Absolutely.
Awesome. I'll give people one more second to finish that up. Great. Thank you to everyone who participated in that. And Heather's going to report back about those numbers once we're able to pull those up. So thank you for your participation in that activity and for being here today. We're really grateful for everyone in the room, and we look forward to continuing these conversations. So we're going to move into our presentation segment of today. Our first presenter is Jenna Dodson. Jenna is our staff scientist at West Virginia Rivers Coalition. She has international experience as an academic researcher and extension agent, and she enjoys bridging the gap between science, policy, and the public. Thanks for joining us today, Jenna.
Yeah, thanks, Maria, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I'll echo what Maria said. I'm really grateful that you're here. And I'm going to start us off by providing some background information, some steps that the EPA is taking, and some recent data releases in West Virginia related to PFAS in drinking water. So firstly, what are PFAS? I'm sure many of you are familiar with this already, but we'll briefly go through it. So PFAS is an acronym that stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's a very large group of man-made chemicals. There's about 10 to 12,000 different types of PFAS, and what they all have in common is that they have the chemical structure of a carbon chain surrounded by fluorine atoms, and that carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest chemical bonds, which is also why they're known as forever chemicals, because that bond is really difficult to break. It doesn't break down in natural conditions. So PFAS don't break down in natural conditions in the environment. They have been used in manufacturing for decades, since the 1950s. So because of that bond, they have really useful properties like being non-stick and stain resistant and water resistant. And they've been used in everyday products that we use for many decades now. So some examples of those products are non-stick cookware like Teflon, pots and pans, and carpet and food packaging, and firefighting foam as well, just to name a couple. How they can get into drinking water supplies, this infographic on the bottom right-hand side of the screen just goes through 5 of the main mechanisms in which PFAS can enter our drinking water supplies. So all those products that eventually wind up in a landfill, leachate from that landfill from those PFAS contaminated products can enter our drinking water supplies. Also, firefighting foam that's used at military bases and other installations. The PFAS can migrate into the groundwater. That's what happened with the Big Springs well contamination for the drinking water supply for the city of Martinsburg a couple years ago. There also is direct discharge from industry into surface water. So an example of that one is the Chemours Washington Works plant in Parkersburg. They discharge PFAS chemicals directly into the Ohio River, which is a drinking water supply. Also discharge from wastewater treatment plants, because standard wastewater treatment processes do not address PFAS. And then lastly, land application of biosolids or the sewage sludge from those wastewater treatment plants, runoff from that application, and that PFAS contaminated sludge can also enter drinking water supplies. So that's a quick and dirty overview of PFAS and all the various ways they can enter our drinking water supplies, and ultimately, if not treated, our drinking water. So next slide, please. At the federal level, EPA is taking steps to address PFAS in drinking water. So this past March, EPA released draft drinking water standards, which are also known as maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs. And these are legally enforceable maximum levels of PFAS that are allowed in drinking water. So they proposed MCLs for 6 PFAS that are known to occur in drinking water. 2 of them, the 2 listed on the uppermost part of the slide, PFOS and PFOA, were proposed to have individual MCLs of 4 parts per trillion. And then for a little bit of context, that infographic there, 1 part per trillion is equivalent to a single drop of water in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So we're talking about very, very small concentrations of these chemicals. The other 4 PFAS that they proposed drinking water standards for are listed in that 3rd bullet point there. They're Gen X, PFBS, PFNA, and PFHX, and those are proposed to be regulated as a mixture using what's called a hazard index. So I put the hazard index formula there at the bottom, which might look a little confusing, but essentially what you do is they measure the amount of each of those 4 PFAS in the drinking water. They divide it by the level at which no health effects are expected to occur, which varies depending on the PFAS. As you can see, that number on the bottom varies. And then all 4 of those quotients are added together. So if the result is less than 1.0, then it would meet the proposed standard. If the result is greater than 1.0, then it would exceed the proposed standard. So these drinking water standards are expected to be finalized by the end of the calendar year. Next slide, please. So in West Virginia, levels of PFAS have been measured in both drinking water supplies, so the raw untreated water, and also the finished water. You can advance the slide. So last July, in our previous Lunch and Learn, we reviewed the results of the raw water study, which tested 279 public water systems across the state and found that 37 of these water systems had levels of PFOA and or PFOS that were above the reporting level. So those 37 systems were then included in a follow-up study that measured the levels of PFAS in the treated water. Out of those 37, 19 of those systems had levels of PFAS that exceeded those EPA's draft maximum contaminant levels that we just talked about. So if you go to the next slide, these are those 19 systems. So you can see the water system's name on the far left-hand column, and the exceedances are highlighted in red. BDL stands for below detection limit, which means that that particular PFAS was not detected. And we'll just go through the results very briefly here. So if we look at the PFOA column, keeping in mind that the draft MCL is 4 parts per trillion, exceedances range from 5.22 at the Union Williams PSD to 27.8 at the Williamstown Water Department, which is about 7 times higher than that draft MCL. If we take a look at the PFOS column, again, keeping in mind that the draft MCL is 4 parts per trillion, exceedances range from 4.41 at the town of Fairview to 34.3 at Department of Veterans Affairs, which is about 8.5 times higher than that draft MCL. And then if we go all the way over to the right-hand column, that hazard index preliminary calculation column, again, that hazard index is an index that is proposed to regulate the mixture of those 4 PFAS that are listed to the left of that column. And if it's greater than 1, then it would be an exceedance of the draft MCL. So in this case, exceedances range from 1.05 Chester to 3.4 in the Lubeck PSD, which would be 3.4 times higher than that proposed MCL. So I'm sure at this point, many of you are wondering whether your water system was tested and how you can access that information. So thankfully, DHHR has created a really great public-facing mapping tool with these data. So if you go to the next slide, I'll quickly go through an example of how you can use this mapping tool and view the data for your particular water system if you're on public water supply. So this is what it looks like when you open up the map. The water systems are denoted by those little water droplet symbols. If the droplet is not filled in, then the finished water has not yet been tested. If the droplet is filled in blue, then the finished water has been tested and you can view the results. So for an example, let's say that we live in Berkeley County. We can use the little plus button on the bottom left-hand side of the map to zoom in. So you can advance the slide. Once you zoom in, you can select the water system by clicking on the little water droplet. And when you click on the water droplet, then a table with the associated data will pop up for that water system. So in this example, we're looking at Rocky Knoll Elementary, and you can see that PFOS and PFHXS were detected. Again, that BDL means below detection limit. So the level of PFOS was 9.19, which is just over double that draft MCL of 4 parts per trillion. And then for PFHXS, we would calculate the hazard index. And in this case, we would find that it is less than 1 and does indeed meet that draft standard. And I'm sure Scott will go into this a little bit more, but the finished water for about 100 more water systems, 106, I think, to be exact, is currently being tested, and those data will be added to the map as they are published. And then just a couple other notes. So the data that pop up in the table are only for the 6 PFAS that have those proposed drinking water standards. If you'd like to view data for the other PFAS that were tested, then you could take a look at the raw data set. If you advance to the next slide, I've included some useful links here. So that raw data set for the finished water is that first link. I've also included a link to the table I went over. I included a link to that mapping tool I went over, and a couple of useful EPA documents too, including how to calculate that hazard index and frequently asked question and answers that folks have had related to the proposed drinking water standards. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions you have during the Q&A. Feel free to just put them in the chat now. And with that, I will hand it back over to Maria.
Thank you so much, Jenna. That was super informative, and we really appreciate your input today. And like I said, we will share all the links that Jenna has spoken about today, and we will make sure that everyone has all of these resources as follow-up to this meeting. So thanks again, Jenna. We're going to move along to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Dr. Alan Ducatman. Alan Ducatman is board certified in internal medicine and occupational medicine. He is Professor Emeritus at West Virginia University and author of more than 40 scientific papers concerning PFAS. He's also a frequent participant on national and international committees tasked with health and safety decisions. Thank you for being here, Dr. Ducatman.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be invited to again be with the West Virginia audience. I apologize for my hoarse voice. Next, please. I'm a little bit under the weather this week. And I've replaced my voice. Clinicians, that of course is another picture of the Chemours facility before it was called Chemours. And clinicians talk about their conflicts of interest. You may know, some of you may know that I helped to design the massive C8 health project for West Virginians and Ohioans who drank contaminated water in the Mid-Ohio Valley. And I was the WVUPI principal investigator on that project. And my conflict of interest declarations include participating as both a paid and unpaid consultant to communities who have sought, and in many cases have now received medical monitoring following PFAS water contamination. Next, please. Oh, and my email address is here. And you can also reach me if you like. Just type in my name in West Virginia University, and the faculty link comes up with an email link. Thank you. Next slide, please. A little bit more about historic sources, because I'm a clinician. I thought I'd talk for just a minute about how one gets exposed. The combination in one West Virginia community of PFOS, PFHXS was mentioned. That is the signature of AFFFs, the firefighting foams, which one will see from airports, Department of Defense facilities, and firefighting training grounds. When that combination is in water, that's the usual source, although PFOS can also, of course, come from industrial sources. And then in our homes, there's any number of industrial uses. These are remarkably useful chemicals. But in our homes, there's all these interesting uses, ranging from really disgusting uses such as in shaving products, cosmetics, flosses, lip balms, things that will definitely go into your mouth, to things you might not think about, such as gun cleaners, piano tuning materials, and for hobby cyclists such as me, your chain cleaners, and for your cross-country ski waxers, for where West Virginia has wonderful facilities, that too. Scandinavian ski waxing teams, ski waxers are heavily contaminated. Next, please. Oh, West Virginia has big photolithography operations as well. That's another source. So the C8 Science Panel, based on West Virginia and Ohio data, made its quote, probable link end quote findings between 2005 running up to about 2013. And most of these came out between about 2010 and 2013. And what they found was higher cholesterol, thyroid disease, ulcerative colitis, testicular cancer, kidney cancer, and pregnancy-induced hypertension are outcomes of PFAS exposure, notably PFOA, but also other PFAS as well. And since that time, much more evidence has come in for kidney cancer and higher cholesterol, and some more evidence has come in for pregnancy-induced hypertension. And there's some nuanced evidence that's complicated for thyroid disease and ulcerative colitis that we won't have time to talk about today. Next, please. In addition, since the science panel made its deliberations, there's considerable evidence, near certain evidence, that liver disease and higher uric acid, including hyperuricemia, that's abnormally high, and gout, one of the outcomes of high uric acid, are also associated with PFAS exposure, especially PFOA exposure. Next, please. And this is an example of one very good agency's reasons for regulating PFAS. This is the California basis for their PFAS health goals. And you'll notice that they cited kidney cancer and liver toxicity, immune toxicity, which is a hallmark of PFAS exposure, suggestive evidence of preeclampsia. And in addition, they gave corroborative experimental evidence, including animal evidence and in vitro evidence. Next, please. And this is the world according to me for PFAS. Obviously, there will be subtle differences between me and other investigators, and big differences between me and industry-affiliated investigators in terms of what we think. But there's very strong evidence for the outcomes in the left-hand column, including lower birth weight. And I've already mentioned some of the other outcomes. Substantial evidence for diminished ability to breastfeed, insulin resistance and diabetes, kidney disease, not just kidney cancer, but also kidney disease, osteoporosis. I've mentioned preeclampsia, which is certainly, and pregnancy-induced hypertension, certainly in the news this week. And then some are conflicting evidence. I call these jump balls or 50-50 outcomes where we're not yet sure which side they're going to fall on, for a longer list of outcomes in the right-hand column. Next, please. So clinicians normally communicate with patients. That's our normal audience, or with public health agencies. And this is sort of the taxonomic look at how we do that. But for PFAS in particular, there's some really important public health individuals who become important public health communication targets for the health information who we don't think about enough. And let's go on to the next, please. Next slide. And these are water utility managers who are well and truly caught in the middle. And in my view, have what amounts to a kind of Stockholm syndrome, where the unfortunate aspects of their job sometimes have them sort of emotionally tied to the polluter, because they have every reason to hope that the health outcomes aren't real. And you can sort of see that in the World Health Organization documents, which are regrettable and which have been noted to be regrettable by literature and scientists all over the world, where water managers and industry-affiliated advocates got together and wrote down their own World Health Organization guidelines. And WHO is going to have to figure out what to do about that. But they're worried. They have legitimate reasons to be worried, because they don't need another large task. They have legitimate concerns they're going to have insufficient funds to do the expensive task. And they have every reason to be concerned that the costs will be passed on to consumers who may not understand why, and who will therefore be upset. Now, all of those legitimate reasons to be concerned about the health outcomes, unfortunately, do not negate that these health outcomes, some of them are certain, some of them are near certain, and they are real and costly, and we're going to have to pay attention to them. And that's the reason why we're talking together today. So I thank you for your attention. And again, questions will be later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Duquesne, for sharing all of that. And I encourage everyone to continue to put questions into the chat, because we will make sure that all the questions, or as many as possible, get answered at the end. So we're going to move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is West Virginia Delegate Evan Hansen. Evan founded Downstream Strategies in 1997. And for a wide range of science, policy, planning, and economic development projects, he manages interdisciplinary research teams, performs quantitative and qualitative analyses, provides litigation support, and communicates results with policymakers, local leaders, private companies, and nonprofit organizations. Elected to the West Virginia House of Delegates in 2018, Delegate Hansen serves on multiple committees, including the Energy and Manufacturing Committee and Natural Resources Committees, as well as the Joint Commission on State Water Resources. Thank you for being here today, Delegate Hansen.
Thanks. Thanks for everybody for attending. And I wanted to start off by also thanking everybody who helped pass the PFAS Protection Act last session. That was a big deal. Kind of remarkable we were able to get that through. And in particular, thanks Scott and the DEP for supporting the bill during the session and for working so hard to implement it. I'm not sure what's going to end up being harder to do, pass the bill or actually implement the bill. I think it's an important piece of legislation. At least it's an important first step in West Virginia. The overall goal of this bill is to identify the sources of PFAS that are showing up in some of the water systems across the state, and if possible, hold polluters accountable so that the costs and the responsibility for cleaning up the pollution or the cost and the responsibility for providing clean drinking water doesn't just fall to the drinking water providers and the ratepayers who are paying the bill. And also the goal is to work hand in hand with the evolving federal regulations like the maximum contaminant levels that were mentioned earlier. There's definitely a role for the federal government, but there's also a role for the state government. So the bill is House Bill 3189, and I'm going to put a link in the chat right now. So that's a link to the version of the bill that passed. And the bill does three major things. Number one, it requires the DEP to collect some additional data and to write plans for certain drinking water utilities. And I'll go into these in a little bit more detail in a second. So that's the first goal. The second goal is related to facilities that manufacture or use PFAS, and it requires them to self-report that to the DEP and for certain provisions to be put in their permits. And then the third goal of the bill is to require the adoption of certain federal standards for Clean Water Act protections in rivers and streams, if and when those are drafted at the federal level. So I'm going to go back through each of those three and provide a little bit more context. So again, the first part of the bill is a series of responsibilities that largely fall on the DEP. And the main responsibility is to write what we call PFAS action plans, which will identify and address the sources of PFAS for the water systems where PFAS has been detected at high levels, at unsafe levels. And there's a couple of subcategories there that I'm not going to go into all the details of, but it sets a certain goal for those water systems for which the PFAS has already been detected above certain levels, and those have to go immediately into the planning process, and there's a certain deadline for that. There's a second set of water systems where the PFAS was detected, but it was at a low enough level that it seemed prudent to resample. And so that requires resampling of the finished water to confirm whether there's an actual problem there, or if it was just maybe a relic of the laboratory method that was used some period of time ago. And as Scott, I'm sure, can talk about more eloquently than me, the laboratory methods are evolving quickly and becoming better and better and more able to detect these things at lower levels, which on the one hand could identify additional problem areas, but also could sort of exonerate issues that might have seemed like they were detected in the past. It might be that when we go and resample them, we'll realize that there's actually not a problem in those locations. So there's the planning process that's required. There's some type of public involvement that's required. and reporting back to the legislature as well. The second part of the bill is the self-reporting, and it requires that facilities that discharge to a surface water under a Clean Water Act permit or that discharge to a publicly owned treatment works under a pretreatment program, including but not limited to chemical and manufacturing facilities, facilities that manufacture or knowingly use or have used one of the certain PFAS chemicals to self-report. And there was a lot of discussion about that specific language, but that's what we ended up with. So it's essentially facilities that manufacture or knowingly use or have used a PFAS in their production process. So it's not the wastewater treatment plants, it's not the landfills, it's essentially those facilities that use it in a production process. And then there's details about what's required after they self-report. There's going to be a certain type of monitoring that's required to identify whether it's coming out of a pipe into the rivers, and changes will need to be reflected in their Clean Water Act permits. That's the second. And then the third part of the bill is a single paragraph. It's the last paragraph in the bill, if you're looking at it. And what that says is that after the federal EPA establishes final water quality criteria under the Clean Water Act for any PFAS, the DEP shall propose adopting appropriate criteria by rule as part of the next regular legislative rulemaking cycle. So to put that in more plain language, this is related to surface water quality criteria. So it's not the MCLs, which is what comes out of the tap. This is surface water quality criteria. It's what's allowed in our rivers and streams. And we expect that the EPA will propose water quality criteria under the Clean Water Act. And what this basically says is we're not going to delay in West Virginia. Once those are proposed at the federal level and finalized at the federal level, we're going to initiate that process. And the process in West Virginia for adopting those rules, it takes some time. It starts with the DEP studying the issue and proposing the rule, and then it goes through the Legislative Rulemaking Review Committee and then on to the regular legislative session. So that's what's in the bill, and I'm also happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Delegate Hansen. And again, reminding people to just keep track of your questions. I see some people putting some in the chat, so thank you so much. And we're going to move on to our final speaker, who is Scott Mandarola, the Deputy Cabinet Secretary of the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. Scott joined the West Virginia DEP Division of Water and Waste Management in April of 2006 and was named Director of the division in 2010. He was later appointed Deputy Cabinet Secretary of West Virginia DEP in 2015 and served in both roles for a period of time. He is now the Deputy Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs, and he serves as the liaison between the West Virginia DEP and outside groups such as the state legislature, federal legislators, other West Virginia state agencies, including the Department of Commerce, Environmental Council of the States, EPA, and Orsanco. Thank you for being here, Mr. Mandarola.
Thank you, Maria. A lot of the information has already been covered by other folks, but I'm going to touch on a couple of things. One, that the DEP, DHHR recognized this as a potential problem back prior to Senate Concurrent Resolution 46, which was passed in 2020. We formed a PFAS work group back in 19, which include USGS, DHHR, DEP, and a few other groups periodically have come in and worked with us. And this is an ongoing group. We meet on a monthly basis to touch on new developments, new data, and move forward. It was very helpful when the resolution first came in 2020, and it was also helpful to engage with these folks with the PFAS bills that have come through over the years, in particular, the PFAS Protection Act this year. There's already been a significant amount of discussion about the testing that was done. But a couple of additional statistics I wanted to throw out there, first in the raw water, then in the finished water data. Most of the raw water statistics that you've heard revolve around the PFOA, PFOS, Gen X. But when you look at the grander scheme of things, of the 279 sources that were tested, 214 of them had a hit of some PFAS compound above the method detection limit. That's 77% of the water systems. The 37 that were chosen specifically because at that time, the new health advisory hadn't come out yet. And those were the 37 highest that were above the practical quantitation limit. After the new health advisory came out in June of 2022, it brought the additional 106 actually is what we're going to be testing for as part of the PFAS Protection Act. And those 106, 100 of them are specific to PFOA, PFOS, Gen X. The other 6 have to do with, we went back and reevaluated the data after the proposed MCL came out. The health index was not a part of the previous health advisories, but with the health index that came out, the proposed health index as part of the MCL, it brought in a couple of other raw water systems that they're not exceeding the proposed health index, but they do have hits for some of those compounds that are involved in calculating the health index. So what we're going to do is we're pulling them into the additional 100 to make it 106 that we're going to be testing. We have already contacted USGS. We have a quote from them at this point. And we have a call, actually I have a call tomorrow with them to try to help finalize this. Although the bill focuses primarily on DEP and gives a responsibility to DEP, we have been working with Bureau of Public Health since the beginning in 2019 on this issue, and we'll continue to do so. We worked together to do the raw water study, the finished water study. BPH initiated that, but we were involved in that as well. And we're initiating this next finished drinking water study, but BPH is also heavily involved in that. The proposal that we've got right now has a timeline of, if we can get this signed in a timely fashion, which we believe we can, the sampling will take place this fall, last quarter of this year. Data analysis will be taking place during that time frame and into the first quarter of next year. We hope to be getting lab data back by the end of the first quarter so that it can be reviewed, QA'd, and prepare a official public data release by USGS by no later than June of next year. We're hoping to be done with the initial 100 samples by the first quarter of the year. Okay, the bill requires us to initiate the study by December. We're hoping to have it initiated, the contract signed by July, early July of this year. So that's the first due date in the PFAS Protection Act. The next issue that we've got to start addressing is the first 37 samples or PFAS action plans that the bill requires us to do. Those are due by next July, a year from this July. Those, we've already got the finished data for. There will be additional data collected on some of those facilities. The EPA has added PFAS compounds to the UCMR5. If you're familiar with that, that's the unregulated compounds that are tested for by public water systems, and that they're unregulated, so they change from year to year. EPA comes out with new ones. In this case, they're redoing the PFAS, and they've dropped the number as far as the number served from 10,000 to 3,000. So any water system that serves more than 3,000 people will have to be testing for PFAS as well this year. So there will be some additional data available through that source as that timeline progresses. In the PFAS action plans, we're required to address, to try to identify the source of the PFAS in the raw water and try to, through regulatory and non-regulatory options, to address that source. As Delegate Hansen has mentioned, the purpose of this is to try to abate somewhat the issue prior to the public water systems having to treat, to try to minimize the expense and the cost to the ratepayers. You know, obviously this issue is not something that we believe that the ratepayers should be dealing with. Sources have been fairly well covered, and I think Dr. DeCapeman did a great job of identifying the non-industrial and firefighting foam issues that we have with consumer products. We view that a lot of this contamination as, well, it's an industrial issue. In certain areas of the state, it is definitely going to turn out, I believe, to be industrial issues. In certain areas of the state, the AFFF firefighting foam, I think, will be identified in the PFAS action plans as the main issues. But there are a great number of products that go down your sewer system every day, including makeups and other shampoos and things of that nature that contain these materials that go into wastewater treatment plants. That wastewater treatment plant sludge may contain those contaminants. They get spread on an agricultural field. And now you've got the potential for groundwater contamination as a source. So that, I think, is going to be, there's going to be a lot of research involved in trying to sort some of these out. And that's the challenge. That's our next challenge. Once we sign the contract with USGS to do the finished water testing, our struggle, I believe, is going to be with trying to identify sources in some of these areas where there is no obvious firefighting foam or other industrial source. The only other issue I wanted to touch on is money. There's a great deal of money available through the bipartisan infrastructure law and some other sources to the SRF drinking water program for emerging pollutants associated with disadvantaged or EJ communities. There's $18 million that's coming in for the next 2 years. And then there's in another pot of money, there's 7.5 million a year projected for the next 5 years. And much of this is grant forgiveness money. So, or I'm sorry, loan forgiveness money. So it's essentially a grant. EPA doesn't call them grants anymore, but they're loan forgiveness. So in a lot of these smaller facilities, there may be some sources of money for treatment should they exceed the MCL and need to deal with this issue as a treatment issue. There's a ton of additional material I can cover, but I think I'm going to leave the rest of the time for questions, and we'll get into it. Any topics folks want to get into.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mandarola, for all that information and for everything that you're doing. I want to take one last moment to thank all of our presenters again for coming and for shedding light on this important topic, and to know that there will be more information shared after this session. I also want to thank our West Virginia Rivers Coalition staff for assisting with this presentation, and I wanted to make sure to do that before we move into our Q&A. So we've had a lot of great questions come in through the chat, and I'm going to try to read some of them and combine some of them, and then we'll give an opportunity in the last few minutes for people to ask questions out loud to presenters. So any of our presenters can feel free to answer these questions. One of the groups of questions coming in were about private wells. How can private wells be tested, and what should folks who are 30% of people who responded in the poll saying that they use wells, what resources or information is there available for folks who use wells?
Well, this is Scott. The bill didn't address private wells. The SRF money that's available is primarily for public water systems. We will either DEP or Bureau of Public Health will have a list of approved labs where water samples can be sent and they can test them. I don't know from a funding perspective where that money would come from. The citizen would likely have to test their own well.
Thank you. Dr. Duquetman had a specific question for him in the chat about these links and associations being only in animals and humans, or do you have more information with a link to human studies that you could talk more about?
It goes into the U.S. National Library of Medicine. He just types in either PFOA or PFOS or PFHXS or PFNA or the PFAS abbreviation that covers all of them, which would have started in about 2017, 2018. About 3,000 peer review articles will come up. And then you have to use modifiers to get at what you want. If you're looking for simplification, we do that for you. Some really good websites are PFAS REAP, REAP website. The EPA recent document has lots of good science. The National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine has a public-facing document about PFAS in your body. And PFAS Central is a weekly update of PFAS news and PFAS science. It's not a complete list, but I want to leave time for others. There are also some non-recommended sites, but I'll leave those out. Those are some good ones, and there are many more on the, I imagine West Virginia Rivers also has its list because the nonprofit agencies tend to work well together. And lots of the nonprofits have great information about PFAS on their website.
Thank you for that additional information. And someone asked about the difference between the UCMR data and the state data that Jenna discussed. Could you talk about the differences or similarities in those two sets of data? And then maybe that's a question for you.
Yeah, sure, I can talk about that. So the state data was a collaboration between DEP, DHHR, which I guess is now Bureau of Public Health, and USGS. And that was from a resolution that was passed back in 2020 or 2021, I believe. So that's state data, more or less. And then the UCMR, so that stands for the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule. That's EPA's rule. So every 5 years, they implement like a new UMCR rule, and it has a list of contaminants that may be present in drinking water that water utilities need to test for. So like I said, there's 10 to 12,000 different types of PFAS. So in this next cycle of the UCMR, they're going to be testing for additional PFAS, like in addition to those 6 PFAS that they have those draft MCLs for. So they are two different data sets for sure. One is a federal data set, and then one is it was published on the USGS data repository based on what was passed in the legislative session a couple of years ago.
Thanks, Jenna, for that. We did get a question about whether PFAS are used in drilling mud for pipelines, and a specific question in regards to the Mountain Valley Pipeline project that we've heard about.
I can answer the question partially. PFAS are definitely used in drilling. Whether they're used specifically in drilling muds for pipelines, it's something I don't know the answer to. So that would be a great thing for DEP to follow up on. Maybe they know already, but I'd be surprised. It's a very specific question. And we're finding, as PFAS science gets better, we're finding new PFAS in places we hadn't previously suspected.
I can certainly follow up on that. I do not, off the top of my head, know the answer to that question as far as MVP is concerned. But I can certainly reach out and get an answer to that question.
Thanks, Scott. And one person mentioned that it sounds like a lot of data collection is going on, but what are the requirements for remediation, including the costs and deadlines for implementation of remediation?
I guess I could take a crack at that one. It's going to depend on what the sources are. For the self-reporting by the facilities that manufacture or use PFAS, there's specific timelines in the bill. I'm looking for those now. So they need to self-report by December 31st of this year. And then there's certain deadlines for their permits to be modified to require monitoring or to require more stringent discharge limits. If sources are found that are other types of permitted facilities, like a landfill, perhaps, I guess I would punt that over to Scott to see how they're planning to address situations like that, a landfill or a wastewater treatment plant. But before I do that, though, I just want to say that other sources could be non-point sources of pollution that would be harder to, that might take different approaches to address. So for example, it could be an old industrial site where it might be most appropriate to get funding through the brownfields program to characterize the pollution and to deal with it, or to go through the state's voluntary remediation program. So those are conceivable. If it's sewage sludge being spread on a farmer's field, I guess that's something that can also be addressed through a permit that's issued to the wastewater treatment plant. So I guess the overarching answer is it depends, because we don't know yet what we're going to find.
As far as the Brownsfield and voluntary remediation programs, both of those programs have started in relation to industrial site assessment, have started looking for PFAS. It's been going on for almost a year now. They started, normally when you're doing a Brownsfield or a voluntary remediation, you have a suite of pollutants that you're looking for in general to identify the condition of the site. And PFAS previously has not been one that's been targeted. It has now moved up the ladder. It's now one of the pollutants that is looked at and characterized on sites when you're getting into those programs. Far as we've done some testing with sewer sludge, and we've looked at a lot of data from other states that have been doing testing, and it's going to be a considerable issue, we believe. From a solid waste perspective, there are certain landfills we do know have, or we have now identified has PFAS in their leachate. And some of them are associated with industrial facilities that we knew were bringing waste to the landfill and contain PFAS. So that's a regulatory scheme that will certainly come into play when the EPA comes out with a water quality standard, a recommended water quality standard, and we adopt it. We have issued limits on some NPDES permits ahead of a water quality standard already, Chemours in particular. They have regulatory limits on some of their PFAS, on the Gen X and the PFOA, which are their two main PFAS.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate that information. And we had a couple questions come in about the technology of removing PFAS from water. And one person asked specifically for municipal water systems, what technology they may be able to use, if anyone could speak to that.
Yeah, I just put that in the chat. So yes, technologies do exist for removing PFAS from drinking water. That was kind of like a prerequisite to the EPA releasing these draft drinking water standards. So technologies that EPA is recommending utilities adopt are granular activated carbon, anion exchange, reverse osmosis, and nanofiltration. And then in like extreme circumstances, utilities might consider switching to a different drinking water supply that's not contaminated.
And GAC has been being used for a number of years around the Chemours facility. They have a enforcement action, a federal enforcement action in which DEP and Bureau of Public Health are parties to. It's been in place since the 90s. And it's been updated every time the health advisory has been updated up until this most recent health advisory. EPA has yet to, we've reached out to them and they've responded that they're working on something, but they have yet to update that. And what Chemours is required to do in those situations is they have to test all the water, public and private, within a certain radius of their facility. If it's above, currently they're still operating under the 70. If it's above the 70, they have to install treatment and pay for the operation and maintenance of that treatment into perpetuity. And they've treated Vienna. There's a number of public facilities as well as private wells that are being treated mostly by granularly activated carbon. So there's a fair amount of information out there as far as the effectiveness of granularly activated carbon working for public utilities.
Thank you, Scott. And we are coming up on time, but I do see one raised hand. There were some questions that were placed in the chat that have been answered throughout the presentation. So I'll make sure that all of that data gets to people as well when we send the resources. So JB, did you want to go ahead and take yourself off mute and ask your question to the presenters?
Yes, I heard 3 different procedures to remove PFAS from the water. I heard granular activated carbon and reverse osmosis. Was there a third one?
I believe it's nanofiltration.
Nanofiltration.
And I believe Jenna put it in the chat. Is that correct, Jenna?
That's correct. Yeah, and anion exchange is another one.
Yeah.
So there's a fourth.
I listed 4 in the chat.
Okay, thank you. I missed it. I'm sorry.
And
Oh, that's
EPA, the EPA drinking water website, I believe, has a bunch of that information on it. Is that correct as well, Jenna?
Yeah, that kind of like FAQ doc that's on resources slide, the link to that is a very useful doc that lists those technologies as well.
Thank you, JB. Roy, we'll go ahead and take your question and we'll do Mary's question after. And then I think we'll have to cut off questions just since we're at time today. But I invite everybody to put any other questions they have into the chat and we'll make sure to follow up with additional information. So Roy, you're up next.
Hey, thank you very much. First of all, I appreciate you all putting this on and sharing some information on this. Second, I'm a farmer and I'm also a candidate for a state elected office. And I heard mention about the agricultural impacts, and at least from Delegate Hansen and maybe the gentleman from the EPA, anybody else if you have that, what do you expect the impact to be on small farmers? And particularly, is there going to be a burden requirement for them to do additional testing, because of water or whatever else on their fields? Thank you.
Well, I think it's too early to know. I think we're in a stage where we're collecting the data we need to make sound decisions. If there's PFAS in significant quantities in the sewage sludge that's being spread on a particular farmer's field, I would imagine the first step would be to address it with the wastewater treatment plant and to make sure that they're doing whatever's possible to make sure that their sludge does not have high levels of PFAS. there's a separate question about whether there's like legacy sites where sludge has been spread in the past that are now showing high levels of PFAS runoff from those sites. And that's a complicated question. I'm not sure if Scott knows the answer to that because, you know, agriculture is generally typically exempted from point source regulation under the Clean Water Act, except under certain situations. So that's a tricky one.
That's true, Evan. One thing I will say, as part of this PFAS work group that we put together in 2019, we have now engaged both DNR to participate, as well as Department of Agriculture in the last 6 months, because we're on a federal level. I deal with a lot of other states, and a lot of other states are seeing issues associated with potential PFAS getting into wild game, PFAS getting into agricultural community and into some of the agricultural products. So we have engaged with Department of Agriculture to have someone from their side participate with us in this as we move forward with this work group. For just that reason, we want everybody involved that could potentially be affected by these issues and be part of the solution.
Okay, thank you. And I just would like to point, certainly we need to clean this up. And I think people who are the prime source contaminators need to be held accountable, and not secondary and tertiary folks, you know, that might be downstream. So I don't use anything like sludge you mentioned, but I might be downstream of another farm that is now responsible for contaminating my farm. Need to be conscientious of the burdens of those downstream small farmers, particular, and how any rules, regulations might affect those folks that just don't make enough money to handle this. You know, and as a reminder, typically the average small farmer makes 14 cents on the dollar for the retail product. So just keep that in mind as you move forward on that. And I would be happy to be part of any work groups and try to find solutions as well. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much, Roy. That was incredibly helpful, and we'll absolutely make sure to follow up with you. We really appreciate that input. Mary, we'll take your question as the last, just to be aware of people's time.
Sure, thank you. What are the panelists' thoughts on the EPA's recent decision to delay CERCLA designation in combination with U.S. Senators Loomis's bill to provide for federal statutory protection for passive receivers, such as municipal water systems, water treatment operators, municipal stormwater dischargers, or other local water agencies and their contractors? And that, of course, would address, might address the legacy issue as well, or the downstream farmer issue. And I'm from the Jefferson County Water Advisory Committee. But I asked that question about the federal EPA in combination with the bill that's been introduced in the Senate.
Well, I don't know the details of that specific bill, but what I would say is that I hope the federal government moves as quickly as possible in addressing PFAS using all the tools at their disposal, whether it's the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Clean Water Act, CERCLA, or anything else. So I hope that there's not any unnecessary delays.
Well, and I agree with that. The one issue, as far as CERCLA is concerned, that was a concern to us when they first presented that, basically identifying PFAS as being a hazardous constituent, is we did not, as a state, and I guess as an agency, turn everything like landfill leachate and or sewer treatment plant sludge into a hazardous material, particularly for facilities like sewer treatment plants that are treating other people's waste. They're bringing in municipal waste mostly. And if it happens to be contaminated because the drinking water in that area might be, or because of makeup and other things. They are not the producer. They are not the industry that's making a lot of money on these products. They're an ancillary user that is treating these other folks' wastes. And the concept of that turning into a hazardous material concerned us greatly when they first proposed that. So as far as that section of what you're speaking to, I think there needs to be some way to tie this back to the original sources and not the ancillary sources. And Evan could speak to this better than me, but I think a big part of his bill, or the bill that passed through legislature this year, that was a big part of that. We don't want to make this a problem that falls to the ratepayers to clean up. Would you agree with that, Evan?
Yeah, I agree with that. That was really the overall goal of the bill.
Yeah. And making it a hazardous material or a hazardous substance could force the end user, not the producer, to come up with a way to pay to clean it up. And we want to try to get it on the front end.
Thank you all so much for all of the questions that were asked and for the answers that we provided today. As I recognized before, we did not have time to answer every single question, but we will be following up with people. There were a great deal of questions that were answered in the chat. So I encourage people to take a look at that, and I'll make sure to save that so that we can use that as a resource as we move forward. And another reminder that you will be receiving a survey after this call to just let us know what you thought and how you hope to engage in this movement as we continue to move forward, because there is a large amount of work ahead of us, and we need people, impacted communities, to be a part of that work. And we want to make sure to give all opportunities for that to be the case. So please look out for other events like this in the future. We are working on a PFAS white paper that will be developed later into the summer and the fall, as well as many of the items that were spoken about today, such as the PFAS action plans, and quite a bit around this topic that will be coming soon. So we encourage you to go to our website, which is on the screen. Make sure to sign up for our mailing list and stay up to date. And if you have specific questions that you want to ask us, you can reach out to us at wvrivers@wvrivers.org. So once again, thank you so much to our presenters. Everyone shared incredibly impactful information today. I learned quite a bit myself, and thank you to all of our participants who came and were a part of today's session. This is a huge topic that can feel impossible to address, but I think the way that we do it, as we've proven, is that by working together. And so thank you everyone for coming and being a part of this, and we look forward to seeing you at future events and opportunities. Thanks, everybody.
Hey,